What is the source of fatigue? There's a central or brain component, and then there's a component that has to do with your muscles. You can show that people with fatigue have more difficulty activating their brain, independent of activating the muscle.
Charge up your axons, ready your receptors, and shift your lobes into upper beta phase. You are listening to Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast dedicated to helping you optimize your brain with the latest breakthroughs in neuroscience, nootropics, and psychopharmacology.
Hello and welcome to Smart Drug Smarts. My name is Jesse Lawler. I am your host, and this is the 136th episode of this podcast dedicated to everything that we can think of that will help you improve your brain and cognition and the brains of those around you as an added bonus. This week we are going to have, I think this might be the first time that we've ever had 3 interviews with the same person, but we're doing it with Dr. Terry Wahls, going for the Smart Drug Smarts trifecta. She is, among other things, the originator of a diet now called the Wahls Protocol, and the last time that she and I spoke, she was just getting started on some studies that would have groups of people going through the Wahls Protocol diet and seeing how it affected some larger sample sizes of people. We're going to be following up on that earlier discussion, hearing about what she's learned, hearing about tweaks to the diet, how it might be altered for one person or another depending on what your physical conditions are, and having some relevant side conversations on everything from autoimmune disorders to traumatic brain injury. That'll be in the main interview coming up in just a little bit. If you hang around until the very end of the episode, I'm going to give you what might be a very useful excuse if you're one of these people that keeps too busy of a schedule, and I'm guessing this applies to a pretty decent percentage of our listenership, those of us whose reach exceeds our grasp when it comes to our to-do list. There might be a silver lining in this. That'll be in the ruthless listener retention gimmick. But for right now, let's kick things off as usual with This Week in Neuroscience.
Smart Drug Smarts, This Week in Neuroscience.
Okay, so if you listen to this show with any regularity, you know, and probably even if you don't, you already know, that exercise is not just good for your body, it is good for your brain. We've talked before about how exercise increases the secretion of something called BDNF, that's brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which makes your brain more likely to create new neurons, new synapses, either and both of which are instrumental in learning and memory. And there's more than just that going on. Increased blood flow, lots of good things about exercise. But a recent study by the NIH, the National Institute of Health, has identified one more likely helper chemical that is responsible for some of exercise's positive effects on the brain. Trying to get a sense of why physical exercise has the effects that it does on the brain, scientists started with cell cultures of muscle cells, so skeletal muscle as it's called, and they stimulated these cultures with a chemical called ICAR, or ACAR. I'm not sure how this is pronounced, but it's all caps AICAR. And this chemical mimics the effects of exercise on those muscle cells. So basically, they made these cells think that they'd just exercised to see what chemicals they would spit out as a result. Once they had a laundry list of those chemicals, they could do further studies and cross-reference with earlier research to see which of those might be known to have effects on the brain. At the front of the pack in the chemicals that were identified by this experiment is something called cathepsin B. Cathepsin B is a small enzyme that is primarily known for its role in the degradation of peptides and proteins inside cells. So now that the scientists had the reason to look at cathepsin B more closely, they took some mice, they got some of them on exercise regimens, they had the other mice sit around, they verified that, yeah, this isn't just something that happens in a petri dish with cell cultures, but we actually see this in real mice. When the mice exercise on a repeated basis, they start generating higher levels of cathepsin B, which starts in the skeletal muscles but winds up also circulating in the bloodstream. Then they took another batch of mice, they did genetic knockouts on them so they could not generate any of their own cathepsin B even if they did exercise. So these mice, they exercised, their blood levels of cathepsin B were unaltered. I'm not sure if that's actually a level of 0 or some sort of physiological baseline, but unlike normal mice, these mice, when they were exercising, they no longer produced new neurons in the dentate gyrus, which is a part of the brain associated with the formation of memories. They also just didn't get better at the tasks they were given. They weren't any better at navigating the maze the way that they normally would be. So this theory seemed to be holding up pretty well, that cathepsin B is a major part of what makes exercise neurologically beneficial. Finally, not satisfied with cell cultures, not satisfied with mice, they wanted to see if similar things might happen in humans. And so a study was conducted. This was conducted in Germany on 40 healthy young adults between the ages of 19 and 34, both men and women in this group. And sure enough, the study showed a significant increase in cathepsin B levels within the blood after regular fitness training. And they also showed that the increases in cathepsin B levels matched well with the ability of the participants to remember and accurately draw a bunch of complex lines and geometric shapes, one of the tests that's commonly used to assess a person's visual memory. Now, an interesting wrinkle in all this is that previously cathepsin B had been linked in other studies studies to a wide array of diseases from cancer to epilepsy. However, it's also believed to have an alleviating effect in the development of Alzheimer's disease. So a lot of interesting correlations with this compound, some of them positive, some of them negative. But in the case of exercise leading to the secretion of more cathepsin B, higher levels in the bloodstream, crossing the blood-brain barrier, and encouraging the development of new learning and memory, that seems to be a causative arrow, not mere correlation. One more piece of evidence on the many benefits of getting regular exercise if that's not something you're doing already.
Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast where smart people talk about smart drugs.
Picked up a 5-star review this week on iTunes from Self-Propelled Bean Counter, great name, who says, I'm a data junkie and this podcast is data crack. Great content, great production, great insight, and great style. May this podcast last 1,000 years. I think this podcast is probably going to last about 35 to 40 minutes, but there will be another one next week. We will get to cognitive longevity and brain uploading and things like that in a future episode, so it would be premature to promise a 1,000-year lifespan for the podcast, but I have no plans of sloughing off this mortal coil anytime soon, so expect us to be around a while. I've got a handful of emails this week. I'm not exactly sure what prompted this, but people from different parts of the world asking if Axon Labs ships internationally. One person asked about China, somebody else asked about Australia. There's one more up in Scandinavia. The answer in almost all cases is yes, there is not shipping to all countries, but if you're not sure, definitely drop us an email and we'll try to get that figured out. The general answer is yes, with a few asterisks. If you're not sure what Axon Labs is, that is our retail wing. We've got a couple of nootropic stacks that we sell over there. Right now, if you think I'm doing a halfway decent job, I've got a couple of pills of Nexus in my system. That is a combination of aniracetam, pycnogenol, CDP, choline, and a phosphatidylserine, which if you can spell all those on your first try, will almost guarantee you'll be the winner of any spelling bee in which you enter. We've also got something called mitogen, which is specifically made for mitochondrial health. A lot of biochemical precursors in there to help your mitochondria make ATP, that's adenosine triphosphate, the universal lowest common denominator energy molecule used within your cells. Your brain as an organ is a well-known energy hog. Anyway, I've been going on at length here. If you're curious about either of those, Nexus or mitogen, both of those are online over at axonlabs.io. Smart Drug Smarts does have a newsletter. We call it The Brain Breakfast. Comes out weekly-ish. Just put one out a couple of days ago that was meant to be a little, 500-word doodad and grew into this epic post, which happens sometimes. You never really know what you're going to get, but we do try to sprinkle it with neuroscience goodies, links to articles that we've been reading and think are worthy of note, maybe worthy of future episodes, or maybe things that didn't quite fit but were close enough that we wanted to let you know that they exist out there. So if you ever want a little bit more of a sense of what's going on behind the scenes here, or read me geeking out on stuff instead of hearing me geeking out on stuff, you can sign up for that over at smartdrugsmarts.com/newsletter. I think that's everything we got for now, so let's move along to the main interview.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So the last time we spoke with Dr. Terry Wahls on this show was actually a really long time ago. She was the guest back in episodes number 15 and then number 27. So over 100 episodes ago now at this point, which is blowing my mind a little bit because I didn't really think it was quite that long. But the last time we talked, she had just published her book, or was maybe in the process of about to go live with it, called The Wahls Protocol, which for some reason I feel obligated to say is spelled W-A-H-L-S. If you do not remember either of those episodes or are not familiar with Dr. Wahls' story, she's got a really well-known TED Talk, a couple of million views, talking about her story. She has multiple sclerosis, and when it first started to really make its presence felt in her life, really kind of took her out of action over the course of a few years, made her unable to work, unable to really do much of anything. Major physical symptoms, lack of mental clarity and sharpness. She kind of realized she was on a very steep downslope, but being a doctor and not being willing to take no for an answer, she went into a deep study on what the actual root of her condition was and what she might be able to do to alleviate some of her symptoms. Came up with the working hypothesis that at its root, what she had was a problem with the health of her mitochondria. And by really changing her diet around, cutting things out, adding things in, and switching to what amounts to a modified style of a paleo diet, she was able to really roll back her symptoms and revitalize her life. The upshot of all this for everybody else being that now this protocol exists that has been helpful not just to her, but to a lot of other people as well. So before we talked, she rattled off a list of a lot of the different conditions that she's been able to see positive benefits to from people that have taken up this diet and made it their own. And it's a long list. Some things which, we think of as strictly physiological, others of which at face value look like they're neurological conditions. But on that list was Parkinson's, idiopathic neuropathy, polyneuropathy, small fiber neuropathy, diabetic retinopathy, lupus, fibromyalgia, rheumatoid arthritis, scleroderma, connective tissue disease, Hashimoto's thyroiditis, depression, bipolar disorder, PTSD, obsessive compulsive disorder, anxiety, moderate traumatic brain injury, obesity, diabetes type 1 and 2, high blood pressure, and severe cardiomyopathy.
I have secondary progressive MS, diagnosed, saw the best people, took the newest drugs, and had a rapid downhill decline, needing a recline wheelchair. Started experimenting on myself, would eventually discover the Institute for Functional Medicine, the paleo diet world. I would ultimately create a protocol that restored my health. So I went from tilt recline wheelchair to riding my bike 20 miles after 1 year of this new intensive protocol. That, of course, changed everything. How I understood disease, how I understood health. It would change my clinical practice. It would change the research that I do. And I have since totally shifted the focus of my clinical work and my research work. And I would do a TED Talk. I would write a book, The Wahls Protocol, that details my story. That's gone on to become a bestseller. And we keep doing more research studies, and I have more grants under review, and my lab is growing, and good things are happening.
From the people that have bought and read the book, do you know how many of those people are actually taking the diet and going off and running with it, actually making it their diet?
I could say that, we've had 2.5 million people watch the TED Talk, and I'm sure we've had hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people talking to their doctors about, well, what about this diet? What about eating all these vegetables? We have well over 100,000 books that have sold. How many of those are actually able to implement and sustain the protocol? I'm not sure. I have followers on Facebook that are always talking about the dietary interventions, and we get success story after success story with a wide variety of disease states. Now, certainly not everyone is helped, and I do hear from people who are like, well, I've been doing the protocol, I'm not helped. And it's a little hard for me to know how completely they're able to follow the protocol. I certainly, when I engage in conversation with these folks, often I find that, well, I'm doing the protocol like 80%.
Right.
And they don't realize that 80% is not doing the protocol because they're still eating a lot of inflammatory foods that can create a lot of trouble.
Yeah, if your diet is 20% Skittles and cheese puffs, that can still be a problem.
And then, of course, there's the other factors that the diet may have to be personalized for your unique food sensitivity issues. It might be that you have problems with kale, and there are some people that have food sensitivities to kale. There might be other food sensitivities that are troublesome for you, nightshades or tree nuts. So the diet may have to be personalized. And then there are other factors, your microbiome, status of your stress hormones, and your other hormonal balance, toxin load, physical activity, how we're activating your brain. So there's more that I talk about in the book and more that I do clinically to personalize the protocol to that person's unique environmental factors and their unique genetics.
The last time that you and I spoke, you were in the midst, I think you might have just recently finished an actual trial with a decent sized number of people using the protocol in a supervised environment. Can you talk now about the results of that controlled environment study?
Well, the original study of 20 people that we followed for 3 years, and we've gotten a couple papers published, another paper that's under review. Hopefully we'll get that soon accepted, because when we do, the videos that we have before and after for all of our study subjects will be available for the public to look at. And that'll be very, very exciting when I have that, because then people can judge for themselves that some people had dramatic improvement, some had modest improvement, and a few did continue to decline. But you don't have to be a statistician to be able to tell that if it took you 2.5 minutes to walk 25 feet and it drops to 40 seconds, that something pretty dramatic happened to have that kind of change. So that will be exciting. We have cognition and mood paper that we've analyzed that data, and that's getting ready to be sent off for review. And while I can't give you the specifics, I can tell you when you have progressive MS, we don't expect cognition to improve. We often see that anxiety gets worse, depression gets worse. And we, again, saw some very nice, very positive, very exciting findings that we'll be looking forward to reporting there. Now, we have another paper that's under review, enrolled people with relapsing remitting MS, and they were either weightless control or they got trained on the Wahls Protocol diet and coached over the phone. We gave them food logs, and small study, just 20, but again, statistically significant favorable results were observed in a wide variety of motor measures and quality of life measures and fatigue measures.
In that 20-person trial, that was a 3-year trial?
My first 20-person trial was 3 years. So we've published several papers. We have more under review, and we're analyzing the MRI data from that paper as well. I don't really know what conclusions we'll draw from that. We're just now pulling up the MRIs and getting that stuff looked at. It's pretty cool that we have that MRI data, and that was only in 8 of our subjects. MRIs are really expensive, so after we got our first 10 that we enrolled, we went back to our funder and said, we have these exciting results. How about funding some MRIs? So they gave us funding to do MRIs. We're able to have 8 pre and post. So that's what we're analyzing.
Kind of have to pick your battles when it comes to funding limitations.
Yeah, it's a small enough group that I don't expect will have statistical significance when it's that small. But it'd be very interesting to see what the trends are. So when we're funding for more studies in the future, we can identify how many MRIs we'd have to get to reach statistical significance and how large that study would have to be.
In the course of doing these studies, have there been any real-world results that have been surprising to you that sort of gone counter to your intuitions?
Well, there are certainly some things that I've learned when I think about this in my clinics. So the VA asked me to create functional medicine clinics where I could do this stuff and quit being in my primary care and traumatic brain injury clinics. So we've been running those now for about 3 years. And I've gone to primary care, specialty medicine, and mental health doctors talking about our work and telling them that they could come watch and participate. We're happy to see anyone who has any kind of health challenge, who's open to using diet and lifestyle, who's willing to commit to being gluten-free, dairy-free, and eating more vegetables. So they come and we give them an introductory lecture, and I'll do it in big groups of 50 to 100 at a time. Tell them my story, the functional medicine, all the principles, and then if they want to come work with us, they have to commit to gluten-free, dairy-free, lots of vegetables, and then we put them through a functional medicine assessment and work on diet and lifestyle.
In your book, you talk about 3 levels of adherence. There's Wahls Level 1, Wahls Paleo, and Wahls Paleo Plus. I'm wondering which of those levels is followed in the studies.
In our studies, we put people, and I've done several studies now. The first study was really sort of a hybrid between level 1 and level 2. We made it an easier diet for the public. The study was really much closer to a level 2 diet. I made the intentional decision to make a level 1 diet that would work for vegetarians and would be more of a transition diet, because the study diet I ask people to do is really pretty tough. In my clinic, I'm sort of halfway between level 1 and level 2. I let people know that, yes, you can have a gluten-free starch one a day if you want, 6 ounces of meat or more, and the goal is 9 cups of vegetables, or 6 if you're female or a really petite guy. And we talk about seaweed, we talk about organ meats. I don't push that as hard when people begin, because, if I'm telling them to give up sugar and gluten and dairy, eat all these vegetables. And what I find is that I'm spending a lot more time talking about addiction and controlling the environment. In our skills classes, we do a lot of cooking classes, talking about growing food, making fermented foods. And now, more recently, we've been having more skills classes with our psychologists talking about motivation, meaning in life, resilience, and how you control your eating environment with family and friends. So what I have more and more respect for is that the reason people fail is not from lack of knowledge about what the diet is supposed to look like. It has much more to do with how do they manage the addictive nature of food and controlling their environment.
Yeah, social triggers can be really difficult, especially if family members and close friends are not having anywhere near as healthy of a lifestyle.
We talk a lot about if excluded foods are your environment, before you know it, they'll be in your mouth and you're chewing them, because so many of our habits are automatic. And you get sort of hungry, you're out there rummaging around, and this delicious food got into your mouth, and you're like, because when we're hungry, we eat food that looks good. So to be successful, it means having to figure out how you're going to purge your environment, which can mean then, how do we have these very uncomfortable conversations with friends and family that I'm addicted to that food that's harmful and I can't be around it.
And actually having people take you seriously. If it's something that they eat, they're like, well, how can you be addicted to fill in the blank food if it seems totally normal to them?
A bite's not going to hurt you, and my friendship isn't that valuable to you that you can't manage this. I spend a lot of time talking about our friends, our social support. We tend to eat what our friends eat. And so that may mean that you have to figure out a different way of socializing, particularly early on, in order to be successful. And have the family commit to, like, I'm all in with you and we will all eat this diet with you when we're together. And if you're not together and you want to go out and have gluten pasta and with a lot of cheese on it, and it doesn't bother you, as long as you don't come home and talk about it, that's okay.
Have you found found that the adherence has been easier for people that have more physiological difficulties, more problems that they're trying to overcome? Because that way their family's not acting like they're just being weird?
In my clinics, I would say it looks like about 75% of the people discover that if I take the gluten and dairy out and I have a cheat meal, I'm going to have noticeable symptoms of something, usually within 3 days. Pain, congestion, fatigue, brain fog, something that's really uncomfortable. And I'll feel like, no, I really don't want to do that. 25% don't have any symptom that they can really identify, but they have what I call the dwindles. They just gradually get feeling not as well. So after 2 weeks or so, there's more fatigue, more mood change, more pain. But because it came on so gradually, it's not as obvious. So for the dwindler, it's much, much harder. For the person who has acute symptoms, the closer it is to when you ate the wrong food, the easier it is for you to say, well, that was not worth it.
Yeah, it's the hand on a hot stove. It's like it's real easy to break yourself from that habit because the feedback's immediate.
So we just spend a lot more time talking about that. What you really want is to have some sort of adverse reaction that you can latch on to pretty quickly. If you don't have that adverse reaction, it's far more difficult to stay completely compliant.
Now that you've seen a number of people that have stuck with the protocol for a long time, have there been tweaks, adjustments to the underlying protocol itself that you've wanted to make?
Yeah, let's talk about ketosis. So I was pretty deep into ketosis for 18 months, felt great. And I would certainly say that I could tell in terms of my mental clarity if I was in ketosis or not.
Were you doing like the blood measurements?
On my finger, yeah, pricked my finger, and I was doing it twice a day, and then I felt to doing it once a day. Then I do it a couple times a week. And then I'd gotten so like I could sort of tell cognitively, okay, I feel like I'm slipping out of ketosis and could check my ketones and like, yeah, was. And then it was sort of interesting. After being in ketosis for about a year, I couldn't appreciate the cognitive difference anymore.
Interesting.
And I thought, okay, well, that's pretty interesting. Then after 18 months, I started reading more that even our Arctic dwellers are not in ketosis year round, that even they get to have summer and would get to have more carbs during the summer, then go back into their high-fat diet the other 10 months out of the year. So I began to think that most of us are from an ethnic region where there was winter and then there was summer. And plus, I have a garden, I have a lot of fresh berries. I thought, I want to go back to eating my berries during the summer, and I'll do ketosis during the winter, and I'll enjoy my garden produce. I still eat a very low glycemic diet. I'm beginning to think that acutely a year of a ketogenic diet might be a very good thing for people who have cancer risk or neurodegeneration. And then, depending on your clinical circumstances, seasonal ketosis may be better. We're really all at the cutting edge of research. We don't really know. But my thought process is I'm just trying to emulate what my ancestors in Northern Europe would have done, say, 30,000 years ago, which is we would have had winter, and then I'm in ketosis. Then I would have had summer, and then I'd be eating a low glycemic index diet with high quality fats, but I still would have had enough carbs. I probably would have been out of ketosis. Then fall comes, and when snow came, probably November through March, likely I would have been back in ketosis.
That's really interesting what you just mentioned there, because it kind of raises the question for people that don't come from an ethnic background of being at a far northern or far southern latitude, somebody that's living more in an equatorial belt, and they never probably would have had a period of the year when there wasn't sugary fruits and vegetables available. Do you think that a ketogenic diet maybe doesn't make as much sense for people of those ethnic backgrounds?
That's a very interesting question. I do not know. I know that historically, or from a biochemical process, our mitochondria can burn fat, sugar, or amino acid, which are protein. So that if we would have been stressed by war or famine, which could still happen even in equatorial regions, we would have survived. So I think we probably certainly could survive, and they could likely do okay in ketosis, but I don't think any region would expect to go on for years and years and years, because that society would have died off.
Right.
But it may have gone on for several months. For those of us who live far from the equator and experienced winter, our ancestors certainly would have expected to be in ketosis for many months every year. And there's plenty of reason for us physiologically to know when you're in ketosis, it helps you break more nerve growth factors. So it's great for your brain. It helps your cells make more mitochondria. So it's it's great for the efficiency of your cells, and it markedly reduces the risk of cancer cells. So lots of reason that ketosis is really a helpful thing. And if you're worried about early Alzheimer's, or you're thinking like, man, I'm not quite as mentally sharp, that's a good reason to have some intermittent fasting. Even if it's a 3-day fast with every season, so you have some religious fasting or holiday fasting, that is great for us. So it doesn't have to be like a 3-month fast. A 3-day fast can be very beneficial.
Yeah, it seems like the idea of hormesis and every now and then just a system shock in one direction or another can be really helpful to the body and the brain in a lot of ways.
Absolutely.
In the published study that you have, I believe that fatigue was the main variable that you were measuring.
Correct.
Why was fatigue chosen as sort of the primary thing that you were tracking?
Well, fatigue is the most disabling problem for people with relapsing remitting MS. It was the first symptom on mine that just really disappeared. Cognition also markedly improved. And there is a robust research on fatigue using the scale that we had, fatigue severity scale. And so we chose that. I really had no idea whether or not I could be hopeful that people would experience the kind of remarkable change in gait that I experienced. So it seemed like it was the safest variable to have as my primary outcome variable. Then we had a whole slew of secondary outcome variables, which had to do with quality of life measures that you do on self-reported surveys, and motor variables having to do with hand coordination and walking speed and balance.
For fatigue, I was just wondering how much of fatigue is physiological loss of strength versus the lack of motivation of like feeling like you can't do it. It kind of seems like it's a combination of both. I'm thinking of like when I've had like a heavy fever, I probably could lift a 50-pound weight if I really put my muscle behind it, but you just feel mentally like you're not motivated to.
Fabulous question. What is the source of fatigue? We have a lot of discussion for people who have MS and other autoimmune conditions and chronic health problems. What is that source of fatigue? The answer is, scientists, we don't really know. We think it is, there's a central or brain component, and then there's a component that has to do with your muscles. So you could stimulate my muscles using electrical stimulation and fatigue out the muscle to the point where, my muscle can't do anything more because we've completely shut it down. And you can measure brain activation and show that people with fatigue have more difficulty activating their brain, independent of activating the muscle. So people with MS and autoimmune conditions have clearly a central component to our fatigue in addition to the muscular component. And then, of course, people wonder, is there a depressive and a mood component? So that's a reason why many of us who do fatigue studies, we always, or nearly always, also do a bunch of measures for mood and cognition so we can make sure that we're not just measuring the effect of depression.
Part of the work that you do, I know, is with patients that have had traumatic brain injury.
Yes.
Can you tell us about how you might adjust your protocols and recommendations with that in particular? And for people that, let's say you're a BMX bike rider or you're driving a race car track and you think that you might have a concussion in your future. Is there anything you can do to like lay the groundwork for?
These are great questions. The answer is yes on all of that stuff. So traumatic brain injury, blast injuries are a very big deal to the military. To do a lot of research in that, I worked in the traumatic brain injury clinic 6 years where we took care of these vets. There's some very interesting work that when you have an acute traumatic brain injury, we set off an inflammatory cascade on the brain, which if you don't get quelched, can feed forward and become progressively more damaging to the brain, leading to problems with memory, with pain, with mood and psychiatric changes. So getting someone who's had a concussion, a lot of antioxidants, intensive nutrition can be very helpful at preventing the feed-forward damage and speeding the recovery. So that's lesson number 1. Nutrition, absolutely vital. Lesson number 2 is omega-3 fats are really important in that initial repair, rebuilding the myelin and repairing the axonal damage. Now, if the person has not been on fish oil at all, they are probably strongly tilted towards too many omega-6s, not enough omega-3s. So there's a researcher that gave individuals extraordinary amounts of fish oil twice a day, like 30 cc's twice a day, gradually tapering down to 5 grams a day, and reported marked improvement and recovery. If you're already on fish oil, then they would measure your omega-3, omega-6 fatty acid ratio in your cell membrane and titrate what amount of omega-3s you need to get that rapidly corrected. So in my clinics, I would have people take 4 grams a day and clean up their diet, and they'd see a big, big difference. The VA and the military recommended that soldiers take 2 and 4 grams a day prophylactically. And that'd be my advice to everyone, is that you ought to take some fish oil. Ideally, get your omega-3, omega-6 fatty acid ratios in your red blood cells monitored so you don't overshoot or undershoot, that you have those ratios in like a 3-to-1. So 3 omega-6 to 1 omega-3 would be sort of the ideal range. The downside of taking supplements is that we can skew the ratios of our nutrients when we take things by supplement. If instead we'd eat grass-fed meats, wild fish, lots of vegetables, some nuts and seeds, plenty of organ meat, you're going to be well nourished. As long as you're getting your nutrients from food, there's far less risk of getting the ratios wrong and accidentally overshooting.
Is that true even now that a lot of our plant food and animal food sources are themselves being raised in fairly unnatural environments?
So it's absolutely true that you want to get your food to be as high quality as possible. So if you can get wild food, wild game, grass-fed meat, animals raised outside, growing vegetables in your backyard organically or from your own small acreage organically, absolutely that is the best. Having said all of that, because I work at the VA and many of my veteran patients don't have much money. So I'm very mindful that I need to help work with them. They're trying to make this as doable as we can for them. You just do the best you can. It doesn't have to be organic. Eat more vegetables. Eat meat. If you can't, don't waste your money on gluten-free products because they're expensive. Instead, get vegetables and potatoes or yams, dried mushrooms, dried onions, dried herbs. That'll go a long way. A lot of my folks are very open to gardening, to foraging for wild food. And I tell them, but the thing you do have to do is you have to cook. If you don't cook your own food, you can't afford this. Getting high quality food that someone else makes for you is going to be far more expensive. So we have cooking classes and we cook with them, showing them how to make tasty food that is not expensive to make and doesn't take a lot of time. People who are chronically ill have to make things simply. We don't have the luxury of a lot of time that we can spend cooking because we're already chronically tired.
Yeah. There's a lot of great meals that somebody can make with relatively few ingredients, shockingly few sometimes.
Shockingly few. Soups, stews, you have a blender, smoothies. And, my feeling is if it takes more than 20 minutes from the time I start to the time I'm sitting down to eat, I'm not making that meal during the week.
Right.
I might do it on the weekend, but during the week, because I work all day, I get home, I'm usually the chef. My daughter will set the table and I'll make the meal. And I expect to be eating within half an hour, preferably within 20 minutes.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So a big thank you to Dr. Wahls for taking the time for that interview. A couple of things to mention there. It is the first week of July as I record this in August of this year, 2016. Dr. Wahls she's done this a few times before, but there's a twist now. She's going to be holding a seminar in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, for people that really want to go hands-on for a few days about the Wahls Protocol and how to live and eat by this diet. 3 days of that seminar are pretty much for anybody, open to the public. There's a 4th day specifically for healthcare providers, medical professionals that might want to get certified to actually teach this diet to other folks. So unlike when she's done this before, there will be a test at the end. Not everybody will pass. There will be an officious-looking proctor, that kind of thing. But if you are a healthcare professional and you want to get certified as somebody who really knows what they're talking about when it comes to the Wahls Protocol diet, that is worth checking into. We'll put a link to that. It's coming up in just about a month. But if you've been looking for an excuse to spend part of your summer in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, now you've got one. Also, Dr. Wahls does have another study coming up that she's actually looking for participants in. This is a study specifically for people with relapsing, remitting MS, multiple sclerosis. So needless to say, this won't be everybody, but if you are somebody like that or you know somebody who is, you might want to let them know that this is going on. I will revert right back to the tape of Dr. Wahls here so she can tell you herself.
We're enrolling people in another relapsing remitting MS study. We'll be comparing a low saturated fat diet, the SWANK diet, which was really the first diet that's been advocated for MS. There's a long history with that, to the Wahls paleo diet. And we'll be monitoring the microbiome changes in the 2 diets. So that'll be very fun, having people poop in a little box for us, and we'll be measuring that. And we'll again be measuring fatigue and a whole host of measures related to thinking, mood as well.
So again, links to all of this up at smartdrugsmarts.com/136. And now, with no further ado, the ruthless listener retention gimmick.
Smart Drug Smarts, ruthless listener retention gimmick.
So I've got some good news for you if you think that you are sometimes just too darn busy for your own good. That might be kind of an oxymoron when it comes to your brain. Researchers at a couple of different schools, actually, this was the University of Texas at Dallas and the University of Alabama at Tuscaloosa, teaming up and looking at information derived by the Dallas Lifespan Brain Study, from which they had over 300 older adults. These were adults ages 50 to 89, and they did a correlational study to look at how busy those adults were, which is just like it sounds like. They're self-reported assessments of how much stuff they had to do in a day, how many things they were trying to jam in, how busy their to-do list was, places they had to go, people they had to make phone calls to, whatever it is, just how much life they had, and how this correlated with their performance on a bunch of cognitive evaluations. A big battery measuring everything from short-term memory to behavioral inhibition to forming memories amidst distraction, lots and lots of different things. There have been a lot of studies showing that things like social engagement are really positively correlated with good cognitive outcomes for older people. And their hypothesis behind this study was that how busy a person is might be a pretty good proxy for how socially engaged they are, that there probably is a strong correlation between those two ideas, especially if you're past the point of retirement. I mean, what do you have to be busy with other than social stuff? Now, first, one funny thing reading this study is that we don't have a better word than busyness in the English language for this, because I can only assume that business, like he's a businessman, is some sort of bastardization of the original terms busyness. But at this point, when we talk about business, we're talking about the wheels of commerce and stuff like that. It's become a word unto itself, and there isn't a noun to describe the state of being busy other than spelling busyness with a Y, which I kept blinking at as I read this study. But anyway, the good news here, or at least I take this to be good news if you're a busy person, this is a correlational study, so they don't have proof positive that any of this is causative, but that everything that they looked at as far as cognitive measures, there was a positive correlation between how busy a person reported themselves as being and their cognitive performance. The busier the better, quite literally. The size of the impact and the level of statistical significance wavered a bit from one cognitive outcome to the next, with the strongest correlations being in episodic memory. Now, one of the assumptions that the researchers were looking into was that keeping oneself busy might be a good sort of protective thing as a person ages. And that may be true. Nothing that they found disputes that, but one thing that seems like it was a bit of a surprise to them was that they found that the correlational match between how busy a person was and their cognitive performance did not vary with age. Now, again, this study had people from the ages of 50 to 89, so a pretty wide range there, and just 50 to almost 90. You know, there's a lot of difference that happens in that time. But what they didn't see was any difference in the level of impact that a person's busyness seems to make, or at least seems to be involved with, on a person's cognition. Now, unfortunately, they weren't doing this study with younger people, that we could see if that trend remains true, like back to 17 years old or something like that. But based on this almost 40-year swath of people, there's no reason to think that the same doesn't hold true for younger people as well. Is it a cognitively good idea to keep a really busy schedule? This is a correlational study, so they can't say the answer is definitively yes, but I guess the alternative hypothesis would be that people who are cognitive high performers just pack their schedules with more stuff because they're able to better handle it. And that seems possible too. I mean, there's probably a bit of both, but that latter hypothesis seems to ignore both human laziness, the fact that some people who are high performers might choose not to pack their schedules just because they don't want to, and that in most aspects of life we tend to get better when we push ourselves. So if you push yourself to be able to handle a busy schedule, that might be reasonably anticipated to improve your ability to actually contend with that schedule. So interesting finding. This might be a nice little stress reducer to think about this. The next time you feel completely overwhelmed, you may be able to take a little solace that maybe at the very least you're giving yourself a great cognitive workout.
Just say no to scratch that. Say yes to the Smart Drug Smarts podcast. Join our mailing list at www.smartdrugsmarts.com.
Okay, you heard it. That is the entire episode, number 136. Thank you for hanging around until the very end. If you enjoyed the episode, please tell a folk or two online. We love iTunes recommendations. We love Facebook likes. We love tweets. We love all that stuff. Everything that we talked about here, all the links, etc., will be up online at smartdrugsmarts.com/136. If you missed last week's episode, in episode number 135, we talked about using the drug ketamine as a potential therapeutic against depression, and also just a general ketamine getting to know you, because we'd never talked about that one before. Next week, next Friday, it's going to be one of two things. I'm hemming and hawing over whether to devote next week's episode to blueberries or DMT. DMT, for those of you that don't know, is a strong and naturally occurring endogenous hallucinogen known by the scientific name dimethyltryptamine, whereas blueberries are a delicious fruit that grow in the late summer, known in scientific circles as Vaccinium corymbosum. So next time somebody asks you what kind of pie you want, tell them you want a Vaccinium corymbosum pie, of course. Anyway, one of those two episodes next week. Not sure which it's going to be yet, but I do know it will be next Friday. Hope to see you back here then, same time, same podcast, and with the same unflagging commitment to helping you fine-tune the performance of your own brain. Have a great week in the meantime, and stay smart.
You've been listening to the Smart Drug Smarts podcast. Visit us online at www.smartdrugsmarts.com and subscribe to our mailing list to keep your neurons buzzing with the latest in brain optimization. Smart Drug Smarts should be listened to for entertainment purposes only. Although some guests on the show are medical doctors, most are not, and the host is just some random guy. Nothing you hear on this podcast or read at smartdrugsmarts.com should be considered medical advice. Consult your doctor and use some damn common sense before doing anything you think might have a lasting impact on your brain.